and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and criticise the idiots who write in stupid things. Now to start off with, I'm actually going to do two letters back to back because they're both on the same topic. So, first letter, Unattractive Men, 16th of May 2014. At Christmas, the young lady that was abused outside Jamie Oliver's restaurant should take comfort in the knowledge that those men are lacking in some department. I bet they didn't look like Brad Pitt or Bon Jovi either. Probably lucky to get a naughty in a brothel with a fistful of 50s. M. Sims, Ballajura. And to go with that, the Christmas song, 17th of May 2014. Those silly young men who abused Pip Christmas and called her ugly need glasses, because Pip, to coin the vernacular, is hot. Leo O'Hagan, North Perth. Okay, so a little bit of backstory. One of the journos for the paper got abused by a car full of young men who basically called her a dyke and called her ugly and drove off. And she wrote a article in the paper about this and made several good points about, essentially the core message of her article was that although the gains that have been made in our society regarding treatment of women have been massive, it's not that we've reached an equal a point of equality, that young men don't routinely or don't get abused by cars full of women in the same way that she did. And particularly in the article she writes about how when she made this public, she's had a flood of other people confirming that they've had basically similar experiences, all women. And so her main point was that, there's still a way to go, and that it's disproportionately young men abusing young women, although to some extent there's also young men abusing young men. But basically, the perpetrators seem to always be men. The thing that disappoints me is there's a whole flood of letters in, and all of them were in support. There was nobody who wrote in anything horrible. But the people in support, even the people in support, were often terrible. So, M. Sims writes in that, the problem was that these young men were probably lacking in some department, you know what I mean? And they were probably ugly too, as if this was the problem. This idea that young men, that you have to be ugly, that being an ugly is an issue, or that the size of your penis is somehow relevant, is part of what fuels the insecurity in young men that cause them to do these kind of things. That's not the only thing that causes them, and I don't think that lets them off the hook. But part of the culture that says that young men have to be a particular way, a hyper-masculinized sort of a view of men, that they have to prove their masculinity, that taken to extremes is what causes these kind of behaviours. It's these young men who are insecure about their masculinity, who are trying to show it by being, rabidly sexist and aggressive. And then the other person, Leo O'Hagan, who wrote in, calling them silly young men, and they must have been ugly because they must have been needed glasses because she's hot. That's part of the problem. Whether she's hot or not is not the issue. Nobody deserves to be abused, whether they're ugly or not. There's nothing sinful about being ugly and misshapen. And whether she is or isn't the issue. Other people wrote in saying, look, chivalry's dead. This is what happens. Some guy wrote in saying that he tried to give $50 to a young girl and got accused of treating her like a prostitute. And that, poor old men can't act chivalrous towards women anymore. And that this would never have happened back in the day is the other underlying theme in a lot of these things. That back in the day, men knew how to treat a lady, and they wouldn't have treated her like that. And the thing that I think this misses is that the people who are writing in genuinely think that's true, but they're casting their mind back to a history, a past, and judging it by the standards of perhaps their own behaviour. And the overwhelming majority of people back in the day, if you like, in the 1950s or 60s or whatever, would have treated women with respect. Just as the overwhelming majority of young men today also treat women with respect. And they miss that there's always been a significant minority of men who have abused young women. They wouldn't have abused the women who were blameless and faultless, that is, those who fit within the cultural stereotype of what it meant to be a woman. But back in the 60s, if a woman dared to look anything other than what was deemed to be correct for a woman, I don't doubt that there were men who would have abused and assaulted her, verbally or physically. I remember a time not that long ago in the 80s in Perth where there was fear for our women based on the treatment they would get from sailors. Now, I don't think that was a relatively modern thing in the 80s, but whenever a boat came in, there was always a little bit of concern about the number of sailors out and about in the street. And if you're telling me that that is something that happened in the 80s but didn't happen in the 60s, I beg to differ. That's always been the case, that there has been a subset of young men that have abused women, and I'm pretty sure that it's actually gotten better. The point of the Pip Christmas article, which was her name, was that we haven't got rid of it entirely. That although we like to think of ourselves as living in a post-feminist society where the battle has been won, these things haven't been completely eradicated. And that kind of retrospective, like, oh, it's just the young people of today who've been sort of, watching too much porn, one, is severely lacking in any evidence, and two, seems to miss the point that I suspect that this kind of incidents have actually been going down, which is also why they're so shocking. Okay, on to another topic. What would the story be if this was nuclear? 16th of May 2014. I see that more than 250 coal miners were killed in a pit explosion in Turkey. Hopes fade for Turkey miners 15th of the 5th. More lives were lost in that single pit disaster than the total that nuclear power generation has caused in its history, including Chernobyl and Fukushima. Guess where the story would have gone if it had been an explosion at a nuclear power station? David Luckett, Chewett Hill. Okay, so there's a kernel of sort of reasonableness in this, that yes, there is some irrational fear of nuclear. So there is some people who hear nuclear and, just irrationally say, no, nuclear is bad and we should have nothing to do with it. That said, that is built on a fairly rational fear of nuclear, and the reason why is not that nuclear power has never killed off huge numbers of people. That's true. Part of the reason is because we've always insisted on incredibly high safety standards for nuclear, far higher than we have on coal. Now, most people who, are anti-nuclear are also anti-coal. So don't they think that people who, are anti-nuclear are somehow like, oh, it's okay that these 250 people died in, coal mine. So part of the reason why nuclear power has a relatively safe history is because of the stringent insistence by people who are sceptical or fearful of nuclear power that it has extremely strict safety standards. But the other thing is, I'm not sure whether you're counting the loss of, if you're doing a nicely sort of an accounting method of the number of deaths, say, caused by things like Chernobyl. So Chernobyl didn't kill many people directly. That's true. But the nuclear fallout from it spread over a large area and caused abnormalities in people, caused diseases in people, and caused diseases in animals as well, which people ate, etc., etc. And so if you look at that, I'm not sure that you could then balance them on. 250 people died, which is a lot. But a lot of people also did have significant health issues as a result of Chernobyl, and have done over the years since, and it's likely to have a similar thing from Fukushima, although to a much smaller extent. But the real problem about Fukushima and Chernobyl, and all of the real concern with nuclear, is that when a coal mine goes bad, the people working at the coal mine may well be affected and killed, and that is tragic. And something should be done about that, and I don't think anybody's arguing that that's fine. But when a nuclear power plant goes bad, it could potentially wipe out civilian population of anybody living within quite a wide range. So not just people who are working in the industry and have some idea about the risks involved, hopefully, obviously not in all cases, but nuclear power can affect people who are completely unrelated to the industry. So somebody who just happens to live within 100 kilometers of it. And also the potential, if things went really bad at a coal mine, you're going to end up with a lot of dead miners. If something went really, really bad at a nuclear power plant, you could end up with hundreds of thousands of deaths. And so that's the risk that people are balancing, and that's why people are against nuclear. It's not so much that it has caused these things, but there's actually quite a strong likelihood it would, especially if we weren't so strict on it. And so the people who support nuclear like to say, oh, look, it's very safe. Well, yes, it's very safe, partially because of all the objections against it and people pushing for it to be safe. And also because maybe we've been lucky. Anyway, next letter. Well, is dry for jobless youth. 19th of May 2014. Permit me to turn Brett Hoffman's letter on its head, Caring for the Young, 16th to the 5th, in which he asked how a jobless young person could survive waiting 6 months for the dole. A young person expecting to be paid by taxpayers for doing nothing for 6 months after registering for the dole is, indeed, ridiculous. How will the disadvantaged kid live? I don't really care, as long as the cost is not coming out of my pocket. I'd much prefer their parents, who dump them on us, to foot the bill. These young unemployed people can live at home with their parents, No need for skip bins, begging, or crime. The previous government blew all our money, and now the current lot are trying to sort out the mess, but the well is dry. And I, for one, am sick and tired of being called on to top it up. No more, enough. Gary Carter, Leeming. Okay, so I wanted to include this letter because it was one of the most heartless I have come across in my time reading the stupid letters in this paper. To really say that you really don't care how a disadvantaged child lives, I think is one of the lowest statements I've ever heard anybody make, in all seriousness. And the other thing is, it's based on completely false understanding of the actual reality of it. So, few young people signing up for the dole are expecting to stay on the dole for a long period of time. The Youth Start or unemployment or New Start or the dole, as it were, is a small payment. It is roughly half of the minimum wage, and the minimum wage in Western Australia is half of the average wage. And so to be on the dole, you are receiving about a quarter of what the average person is earning a week. And it is on the poverty line. So any person on the dole almost certainly wants to get a job. Almost certainly wants to. Here's the scary thing, is that about half of the young people on the dole in WA have been on there for more than a year. So the unfortunate thing is that when you sign up for the dole, when you're unemployed, there's a 50% chance that you are not going to get a job within the next year. That is, you're going to become a long-term unemployed person. That's the sort of the harsh reality of our job market, is that while there are a lot of jobs for people, disproportionately those people who can't get jobs are the young and the unskilled. And so the government's recent shift to say that young people under a certain age, when signing up for the dole, will not be able to receive a payment for 6 months, also misses the point that the vast majority of, or a significant chunk of those young people, will not be able to rely on their parents. A large number of the people who are on the dole as a young person come from fractured backgrounds. And so for this person to say they should just dump, that the parent should foot the bill. Well, often in these cases, there isn't a parent who's going to foot the bill. That's part of the reason why this person is asking for assistance from the government. Disproportionately, people who can receive assistance from their parent don't receive assistance from the government as a young person. They are either in study or they're able to get a job. And also to say that the previous government blew all the money and that we've had to cut youth allowance to try and cover for this spending misses the point entirely. Is that government spending has actually remained flat for the last 10 years. It's roughly 26% of our GDP and has stayed that way for about 15 years now, since about 2000. The government before that, have not been making significant increases in spending or particularly strong cuts either. What has dropped off is revenue, and the last government brought in a series of measures to raise revenue, which have been dumped by this government. So this government consciously decided to dump the revenue resources and consequently had to cut savings. Now, the crazy thing in all of this is that the youth allowance payment in the current year will total about $10 billion for the country, which sounds like a lot, but it's about 2.5% of the overall budget. To put that in perspective, that's about a fifth of the aged pension. And the age pension is going up. The amount the government is spending on age pension is going through the roof. The amount that it's spending on youth unemployment is actually relatively flat and is a small component of the budget. And this 6 monthly thing will save them very little money because, as I said before, at least 50% of these people can expect to be unemployed for at least a year. And so they are going to get through this 6 month period and then be claiming the unemployment benefits, and potentially for a reasonable amount of time. And so without doing something to address long-term youth unemployment, this is not going to help the budget in any kind of significant way. What it will do is scapegoat young people, which is always a trick for the right. The right love doing that, and obviously people like yourself, who's got your money and doesn't want to help anybody else out, lap it up. All right, last thing for the day. To shed debt, 20th of May 2014. Worse off. That is the mantra of Bill Shorten and his ministers spruik about the budget. Yet, if the coalition government had not taken action, the whole country would not just be worse off, it would be so burdened with debt that Spain, Greece and Ireland would look like paradise. We cannot keep expecting hard-working people that have accumulated wealth to keep paying for everyone. This is a wonderful country, but we all need to do our share and not expect other people to pay for the way we want to live. Dawn Jakovic, Ardros. Now, the thing that you've missed, because you obviously haven't actually read the budget papers, which is fair enough because very few people do, is that the increases in debt, one, debt is projected to increase under this government. And two, it's expected to increase at exactly the same rate that it would have done under the previous government. So all of the major cuts to debt and spending that this government has introduced essentially will not pay off for at least the next 3 to 4 years, i.e. after the next election. And so all of this talk about having to make cuts to balance our budget, all of the significant cuts that will actually balance the budget are not going to happen for the next 3 to 4 years. All of the cuts that we're experiencing now have nothing to do with balancing the budget. They're about political games. Secondly, our debt to GDP ratio, so the amount of debt we have essentially, is relatively low, as everybody keeps saying. It's around 50, I think it's around 50% of our net debt is about 50% of our GDP. And it has been that way for quite a while. There were some bumps. It did increase during the global financial crisis, but it hasn't increased dramatically, nor was it projected to either. The dramatic increases in overall debt that are projected are 4 or 5 years out. Essentially, it's well known that we have a massively aging population, that the proportion of people in Australia who are post-retirement age is going to increase dramatically over the next 20 years. And as a result, the amount of people who are earning, i.e. and paying income tax, which is a significant portion of the government's revenues, is going down. The number of people drawing an aged pension or similar is going to go up in a way that is completely unsustainable and has nothing to do with this government, the previous government, or any other governments. I don't really know anything about Spain, Greece, and Ireland, but I imagine that there was some degree of a similar thing happening there. And yes, this will take long-term structural, not even long-term, this will take some medium-term structural reform that is absolutely necessary right now. Unfortunately, all of the cuts that people are complaining about have done nothing to do with this. The real cuts aren't coming yet. And so I suspect that this is a bit of sort of political work, that essentially if you're going to have to make long-term cuts, you may as well make some short-term cuts because you're going to get it in the neck anyway, either way. And that way you can kind of, get your scapegoating cuts in. Young people are the problem, we'll stop paying them. Don't worry, we're screwing over the old people too, but don't pay too much attention to that. And that's the state of the world in the West for this week. As you can tell, my voice is pretty much gone, so I better give it a rest. Federal budget is always an interesting thing. The amount of uninformed people writing into the newspaper to complain about it is incredible. Anyway, I hope you've had a good week, and I'll see you next week where we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.